The way the businesses set prices for products and services is increasingly by using a method called dynamic pricing. In this presentation, my group and I will present what dynamic pricing is, its concepts, how it is applied, and how it is disrupting the marketplace. So don't go away, hold your breath, and stay put. So, what is dynamic pricing? Key thing to remember is that dynamic pricing is all about flexibility in pricing. The price of a product or service changes as certain factors change. These factors are typically those which impact either the market demand or the supply. We will talk about few of these factors in the next slide. So dynamic, as the word implies, is a changing price as opposed to a static or a fixed price. For few of the factors which affect dynamic pricing, like it could be the level of demand for a product or service compared with the availability of the product or supply of that product. It could be based on the location of the customer, the time of the day, or the day of the week. It could be also based on what the competitor is charging for the product or where the customer is in terms of her buying journey. Has she been searching for the product for a long time or does she have to buy the product immediately? So, a lot of those different factors can be used to construct the logic that determines the dynamic price. What dynamic pricing really needs is the data. Key link between dynamic pricing and business decision making is the big data. This capture of billions of pieces of transactional data every day, every hour of different sorts that enables computer programs and algorithms to use that data to make a pricing decision and come up with a price that typically aims to maximize business revenues. Lots of industries make use of dynamic pricing, and I'm almost certain that you have come across at least few of it. For example, when you search for a hotel, depending on the time of the day of the week, and the availability of hotel and rooms, the price shown to you would have been different. And that is also usually the case when you look for flights to travel. Perhaps the best example for dynamic pricing, although somewhat controversial, is the pricing done by Uber, the taxi rideshare company. Uber uses a method of dynamic pricing called surge pricing. In that, the price of taxi goes up when the demand for taxis are high and supply is low. Retail sectors also heavily use dynamic pricing. So there are lots of examples of markets and industries where dynamic pricing is increasingly being used.
Next, we're going to discuss the differences between static and dynamic pricing. An example of a static pricing model would be a taxi cab company that charges a fixed rate regardless of fluctuations in supply and demand. Because they don't change their price, there are times they are charging too much and times they're charging too little, and because of that, they are missing out on potential profits. In comparison, in a dynamic pricing model used by companies like Uber or Lyft, they are changing their price real time to match the number of passengers who needs rides and the number of drivers in a given area that allows them to capture more profit. Increases in profits are one of the obvious rewards for implementing a dynamic pricing model. On average, companies see an increase in EBIT of 1.5 to 3% when transitioning from a static to a dynamic model. You can also change customer purchasing behavior such as timing. Imagine running a concert venue and knowing ticket sales data 2 to 3 weeks ahead of time rather than the day of. With that information, you would be able to more accurately staff the event and purchase the right amount of concessions, which would lead to cost reductions. In that same vein, as you increase your knowledge and control of pricing, you'll see increased efficiencies across the value chain. As your sales forecast accuracy increases, you will also see operation and supply chain efficiencies follow. All of those things will lead to cost reductions and increases in revenue. In spite of the increased profit potential, there are also risks associated with implementing a dynamic pricing model. The first would be alienating your current customers. Some customers may prefer the transparency of a static pricing model and be pushed towards your competition that has that. The second would be customers gaming the system and waiting out demand till it drops low enough and purchasing at a lower price than they might previously have. There are also ethical concerns with industries like healthcare, where willingness to pay probably shouldn't have an impact on the availability of a good or service. There are also large upfront development costs, where you would need detailed, real-time customer tracking in order to accurately implement a dynamic pricing model, whereas a static pricing model is far more easy to implement. As a result of the risks and rewards associated with dynamic pricing, it will be beneficial to some and detrimental to others. Some of the winners will be the first moving companies that adopt dynamic pricing. They will gain a competitive advantage over their competition. Customers who are willing to pay more will also have an advantage because they are all but guaranteed access to goods and services. And then industries that have high variability of supply and demand will see the most benefit of companies transitioning to a dynamic model. The losers will be businesses that are too slow to adapt. They will fall behind to their competitors who implement those models. And then also customers who can't afford peak demand prices, because they will oftentimes be priced out of goods and services that they previously could afford.
So once a company has learned about the benefits and disadvantages of implementing a dynamic pricing model, the next logical question is, how much money will this make me? The revenue potential for dynamic pricing is somewhat challenging to quantify, though, because as we previously discussed, dynamic pricing is implemented through an algorithm based on a variety of different factors. However, people much smarter than us at MIT have estimated that a dynamic pricing model can boost revenue by up to 8%. So in order to estimate the revenue potential for the next 3, 5, and 10 years, we considered the projected baseline revenue growth for industries that haven't adopted dynamic pricing, like apparel or retail and consumer electronics. We excluded industries that have widespread implementation, such as transportation and travel, since their revenue potential has already been realized. So then we applied an 8% growth rate on top of the baseline revenue. As a result, we've estimated that the implementation of dynamic pricing in these two industries could generate up to $39.3 billion, $40.5 billion, and $43.7 billion over the next 3, 5, and 10 years. Okay. So now we've talked about what dynamic pricing is, who's using it, the good, the bad, and we've shown you the money. But is this really a disruptive technology? Two key factors in disruptive innovation theory are, one, that the innovation begins in a low-end market or a niche or even new market, and two, that the innovation starts as a lower quality or underperforming product as compared to what's already available. If we look at Uber and its implementation of dynamic pricing as an example, we can look at the first factor and ask if Uber began in a low-end or new market. The answer is easily no, because taxi service was certainly not a new market, and Uber went directly to the same consumers using taxis. So then we can look at the second factor and ask, did Uber start as an underperforming product or service? And the answer is another easy no, because Uber provided the same service of getting a person from point A to point B. In fact, they even gave you the option to pay more for a fancy car that didn't smell like vomit. So really, we don't think dynamic pricing qualifies as a disruptive innovation. It does, however, create a lot of revenue potential for firms, but at the end of the day, it's just a pricing strategy, or even a form of price discrimination, which you all learned from our economics class. And that's a strategy used by firms to increase profits by charging a different price for the exact same product or service. That concludes our presentation on dynamic pricing. We hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for listening.